So now the recording is started. I'll just reiterate that stuff so it's on the record, right? Parenting, child first, parent second. Parent constraint, driver first, passenger second. With parenting, you're changing the hierarchy. That means that the two objects that were separate are now joined. You will see that one object is underneath another. It is now part of another object's hierarchy. So it's basically like nested. So you would have the parent. You look in the outliner, there's the parent, and then underneath that node is the child. So the child is there. So anytime you move the parent, you move the child. They move together. But the child is not fixed. The child has some freedom to a degree. So what that means is, with the analogy here of the pen, I can take the pen and move it away from the wrist, and they're still connected. There's still a child-parent relationship. But anytime I move the wrist, it's going to funnel information to the pen. So parenting is not a good solution if you have a prop that has to be put down and left behind, right? Because if I need to let go, then the problem is as soon as I move the wrist, the pen moves. There's always a connection. So that's not ideal, right? Because it's useful if I have a prop like this, put on a hat, right? It's always on my head and it's never going to come off. Then you would say, okay, let's do a parenting, right? It's part of the rig, it's part of the hierarchy, it's never going to come off. But as soon as you tell people, I need to take this hat and drop it, I need to move it, I need to take it from one object, one hand to the other, to the head, to another character, parenting isn't going to work, because one of the problems is that you can only have one parent. You cannot parent an object to multiple objects. So there's limitations, right, with parenting. But for some situations, it's ideal. So if the object is just part of the character and you can set it up in a way it's always going to move, it doesn't come off, parenting might be a good choice. But with a constraint, what a constraint gives you is some options, but also some restrictions. So once you have a constraint, the passenger is frozen. What that means is that the moment you hit the constraint button, this object will now maintain its translate and rotate position. It will stay like that. It'll only move with the wrist. If I want to change the pen and say, oh, actually, I'd like to change the grip and do that, I can't, not with a basic constraint. What happens with a constraint is it will always remember its position to the wrist, and it will only move with the wrist. It will not move with the fingers, so the fingers will go through it. If I try to move the pen, it will snap back to the original orientation. So if it's a very simple object, like again, my glasses being on my face, let's say I just want them constrained, but they're separate objects, then I have a constraint. I can constrain the glasses to the head control and they'll move. And then the real issue is, well, how can I take them off, right? How do I take them off? Well, then what I would have to do is I'd have to have more than one driver. I would have to have driver one would be my head, driver two would be like my left wrist, and then driver three might be a table. I want to lock it to a table or something like that. So you can have multiple drivers, but what you have to worry about are basically the on and off switches. So a constraint comes with a switch. So something can be constrained 0%, and it can be constrained 100%, and it can be in between. So it's like a dimmer switch of a light. You can either treat the light as completely flick on or flick off. It's either 100% on or 100% off, but you can also have something that's partially constrained, which is a bit frustrating. Sometimes that's not what you want. It's usually a mistake. But this is the big difference between parenting and a constraint, is that a constraint has a switch. You can turn things on and off. So that gives you some flexibility. So it means that if I key the constraint off, then as soon as I move the hand, it's off, the pen would no longer move with it, right? So I can have a moment where the pen is lying on the table, the constraint is set to 0, and then as soon as I touch the object, over one frame, I go like 0, 1 frame, next frame 100%, and now it's glued to the hand. The frame before, there's no connection. The next frame, there is a connection. So you treat it very binary, right? So it's either all or nothing. It's on or it's off. But the possibility is you could potentially have this as a bit of a dimmer switch. Okay. Now, what you typically find is, especially with studio tools, is they use a blend of both, which is when you get to more complex setups. So I know typically in this class, a lot of people might raise their, what if I want to do this? What if I want to do this? Say, don't worry about that right now. Let's get the simple constraint to work. And then later we'll figure out how we can use some of these setups. And it's not usually just the animation team. There could be situations, again, particularly in rigging, a lot more problem solving goes on with making a rig. So the rigging artists are usually the best people to go and talk to. So when I'm struggling with a setup, that's usually when, if I can't figure it out with myself or my supervisor, we'll go talk to the riggers and say, hey, how would you solve this problem? I need a character to do this. I don't know how to set it up. What are some ideas? Just because they've encountered so many problems in their day to day, right? Solving problems all day long is what a rigging artist does. Is they may have a very elegant or simple solution that maybe you just didn't know because you just don't have the experience. But the simplest thing that every animator encounters is I need a character and I have to stick them to a prop, or I need a prop to stick to the character. I want to put a character on a skateboard. I want to have a character pick up a cup. All those kind of things you have to learn how to deal with technically so that you can get things to work, right? Otherwise your scenes, right, you're very limited in the kind of stuff you can do. And next time you watch a film, right, a CG film or a TV series, look at how many times the characters interact with one another. Look at how many times if there's a wrestling match and all the characters are trying to grab a football or something like that, a kid's playing soccer, you'll start to get an appreciation for like, wow, that's actually, to make that look convincing takes a hell of a lot of work. It's not that easy just to kind of, it's not something that's built into Maya's tool set. Okay. So parenting versus parent constraint. Okay. Does anyone have any questions with the difference between the two before I move into a demo in Maya? I'll fire up Maya while people are pondering. Everybody's good? Clear so far? Somewhat?
Clear.
Yep.
Yeah?
Clear as glass.
Okay, I hope so. And if you're not sure, I can explain it again, right? It's no big deal. This was something that caused me no end of frustration because when I was very new, the first CG project I'd worked on, I was there on a Monday morning. I had 3 hours of training, 3 hours of training before joining a project with no experience in Maya, zero. And the first thing they throw at me is a sequence with a character holding a guitar and playing it. It's very technical to set up. It was very painful. My supervisor was very kind and sat me down. And for weeks, I didn't know what the hell the difference is between these two. And that's a very common problem when you're new. So there's nothing to feel ashamed about. If you're like, I don't get it, raise your hand, ask a question, because it's very easy to confuse the two. They sound the same. Parenting, parent constraint, potato, potato. You think they're the same thing, but they behave very differently. All right. Everybody's okay? All right. So let me switch over to Maya and we'll see if we can kind of use this as an example to sort of start with something really simple. And I'd ask that you follow along with me. And we're not going to do anything. You don't need a file. I'm just going to make a sphere and a cube, and we're going to try to glue them together with a constraint. I'm going to show you how you can connect things with a constraint and then pull them apart. Okay. So I'm going to use my amazing default modeling skills and just make a cube and a sphere and slap them here right at the origin. And I'll grab the sphere and I'll just move that up. Okay. And this may not be the best contrast. That's probably, is that a bit easier to see? Hopefully. Yeah.
Yep.
Better.
Good.
Okay.
Yep.
So I've got the cube. I guess I'll be good. I'll put the cube on the ground and I've got the sphere and put them up like this. So the idea is what I want to do is something very, very simple. I want to have the sphere start up here. I'm going to have it come down, touch the cube. And then when it goes back up, I want the cube to stick to it. I want to imagine it's like a big magnetic arm coming down, picks this up and then leaves, right? So a very, very simple example so we can start figuring out constraints. Now, as I mentioned, if I wanted to parent these two together, right? So if I said, okay, I want this to be the parent of this, then I select the child first, then this, and I hit P. Okay, and you see what happened in the outliner. The cube is now underneath the sphere. So what happens is now every time I move the sphere, I move the cube. So this is not going to work, right? Because if I move the sphere, then I have to grab the child and move against the parent. They're going to fight each other. One's going down, one's going up. And if that one doesn't go up the same way that one goes down, they're going to wiggle and wobble and boil and it will never work. And the whole time I'm going to be frustrated because every frame I'm having to fix this. So this is not a good system. This will not work. Now, what's nice about this is that I have freedom. If I want the cube to be on the top, great. anytime I make a change, there's still a connection. So that's one thing that's really powerful about parenting, is that you can change the position of the objects right there on the spot. But with constraints, you don't have that luxury. Once you make a constraint, if you don't like the relationship between the two objects, you have to kill the constraint and start all over again. So it's not as flexible, okay? But it does give you that option that I can turn it on and off. So if I want to unparent this, what do? How do you unparent? What's the keyboard shortcut? Anyone remember? Shift P, right? So remember, like a small letter P is parent. Shift usually does the opposite, right? So shift, so capital P, if I grab the cube and I go Shift P, now it's out of the hierarchy, completely free. There's no connection between these two anymore. So I'll put this one back at the origin, zero it out, move the sphere up above, move that one up there, and okay, good enough. And I'm going to start by just having the sphere up at the top. And this step is important. When you're setting up constraints, it's really important etiquette to key the objects first. And I'll explain why later with an example. So I'm going to start by grabbing the objects on frame 1 and hitting S. So what's important about this is by hitting S, you're recording where they start. You're recording the start position of the cube and the start position of the sphere. They're locked. I'm saving a key. And this is just important to remember later on. And I'm not going to agonize over timing or anything like that. I'm just going to go 10 frames later at frame 11, and I'm going to create the contact position. I'm just going to drop the sphere down. So right there. So frame 11, I'm touching the cube. And again, grab both objects and hit S. And then I'm going to go to frame 21, and I'll just move the sphere back up. If I wanted to, I could just copy frame 1, right? That's an easy thing to do. I could just copy frame 1, go to 21, and hit paste. And what 21 again, I'll grab both and hit S. There we go. So what you'll see is all I have is the sphere just going down, touching the cube, and then going back up. Right? There's no connection. Nothing is working. But I've blocked in what needs to happen, that the driving object is going down, it's going to touch the passenger. And when it comes back up, I want them to be connected. Okay. So the next step is, once we have kind of our initial blocking, particularly the contact pose, then I'm going to start applying a constraint. And we'll sort of see what kind of crazy things happen when we apply a constraint. So what you do is you go to the contact pose. You want to create the constraint here because this will create the relationship between the two objects in terms of where they are relative to one another. Okay, so you want to make sure, if you're going to do the constraint, you make sure, okay, it's the moment I'm picking up a prop, the moment I'm touching another character, the moment of contact is where you usually create the constraint. So I'm on that frame, and now I have to be very careful with the order, right? I need to select who's in charge, the driver, the one that is going to do the moving. So that's the sphere. I select that one first. Then I'm going to select the cube, driver, then passenger. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a constraint. I got to get out of the modeling tool set, go to animation or rigging, go up to the constraint menu, and I'm just going to pull off this menu so we can have a look at the options. And 1 and 2. The constraint that you'll typically use as an animator is usually a parent constraint. A parent constraint gives you translate and rotate at the same time. If you don't need any rotation, well, then you would use a point constraint. If you don't need any translation, then you would use an orient constraint. So a parent constraint is a double whammy. I could apply a point and an orient if I wanted to, but I'm going to go with a parent because it's simpler. So it's going to be a parent constraint. But before I click on it, I'm going to go to the option box. I'm going to go to the option box and pull that up. Now, the most important box here to consider is maintain offset. If this is checked, and this is typically what you want, it means that it will preserve the distance from pivot point to pivot point. So that means that if I have the character's pen and the hand in that pose, when I apply the constraint, it will keep that. If I don't have the offset checked, what will happen is the pen's pivot point will snap to the wrist's pivot point, and now the pen will be going through the wrist. So if you have this option off, it will make their pivot points match. They'll merge. Okay, sometimes that's useful. That's maybe what you want if you want to match one object to another's position. But in this case, we don't. If I do that and hit apply, the cube now jumps into the sphere's pivot point. It's still there. If I hit 4, it's in there, but it is now snapped to that pivot point. That's not what I want. So I'm just going to hit undo, go back to here. So what I want to make sure I apply is offset. You also have options to choose all the translate or all the rotate. Sometimes you might have a situation where you don't need them all, or it's very important to avoid one or the other. So we would make sure that we check those as we need. For this one, I'm going to just use all, keep the default, all translate, all rotate. And then I'm going to hit apply. And let's see what this looks like. When we hit apply, I'll close this box. What you'll see with both objects selected is there's this new attribute, blend parent. And this is on the passenger. If I just select the sphere on its own, there's no new items in the channel box. But the object that's being constrained, the passenger, has this new item here called blend parent. This is the switch that I mentioned before, the 0 to 1, right? So on and off. And the default is that as soon as you apply the constraint, what you'll notice is that for the entire scene, I have basically switched the light to the on position. It is always constrained. Even though at frame 1, I didn't constrain them, what's happening is at frame 1, right, because this blend parent is on, it's not keyed. You can see that it's not red. That means that it is on all the time. If I change this number to 0, it is off all the time. But if I key it, then I have some control. Then I can choose when it turns on and when it turns off. So in order to do that, what I would do is I would select the object here at frame 1 and say, yeah, at this point, I want this to be 0. So I can just hit S, or I can right click on this and say key selected. Now it's keyed, it's off. Then at the contact, what value should it have? What should be the value here? Any guess? If 0 is off, what would be on?
1.
1. Okay, let's give that a try. So I switch this to 1. Okay, right click, key selected if it doesn't turn red. And then I'll go up here to 21 and I want this to be on as well. So you can see it's still on, but it's not keyed. So I just hit S. Now it's keyed. And what you'll see in the graph editor is now there's this new attribute, blend parent. So this is the switch. I keyed it at 0 here. It's at 1 here. It's at 1 here. Now, what's happening at the beginning is not exactly what I want. This is what I mentioned, that you can have a dimmer switch where it'll sort of basically drift from 0 to 1. So that means the constraint, if I come over here, the constraint is basically running at like 30%, right? Very tiny. There's a little bit of connection, but not very much. As I get closer and closer, right, it's getting closer to 100%. So this is not quite what I want either. So I need to control the behavior of this a little bit better. And what we'll usually do is we will create a 1-frame transition. So we'll go to the contact pose and we'll duplicate it. So I'm going to take frame 11 and I'm going to copy it to 12. So 11 and 12 are going to be exactly the same. But what I'm going to change is that the first key, I'm going to lock the switch to off. And then the next one, it'll be on. So I need like a 2-frame transition where I can have the constraint off and then turn it back on. So I'm going to just make sure I select both objects. And I'm going to copy frame 11. And I'm going to go 1 frame later. And I'm going to paste that in. And I'm going to go look here at the constraint, the blend parent. Right now it's drifting from 0 to 1. So I can go over here and I can set that to 0. So I can change that. And I can do that in the graph editor. And I can also do that here in the timeline. I can just go to the frame, select the object and say, yep, let's make that 0. Right, set the key, make sure it's keyed, make sure there's a dot. And then what I've done is I've protected that first chunk. It's now held. That 0 value is now held. And it will only change over this 1 frame. So at frame 11, no connection. Frame 12, there is a connection. So we're always trying to hide those constraints. It's a little bit of a delicate matter sometimes. If you look at more Saturday morning TV stuff that's a little bit lower budget, a lot of times when characters pick up props, it's very abrupt. They kind of, it feels like a magnet. Sometimes it feels like the prop jumps into their hands because we just don't have the time to finesse the connections. It's a little bit more kind of, they just kind of get sucked into their hands. And other times, of course, what you're worried about is that if a constraint kind of drifts, that you had this sort of Jedi mind trick going on, that it's like it's sort of moving a little bit. It's a little bit kind of wobbly. It's not quite contained because you have these issues where the blend parent, you have to kind of key the constraint on and off, right? But now when I go over here, I can animate from here to here, and there's 100% connection between the two. They're completely connected. Okay. Does anyone have any questions? This is a good point to take a little pause and fire away and see if there's anything that didn't make any sense. Anyone? Did everybody try it and get it to work? Yeah, so. Because if you don't try it, don't just watch the video and assume it'll work. You got to try this, right? Because you'll make tons of mistakes doing this. And the only way to get better at it is to keep on trying and make sure that it works. Okay. It's only going to get more complex with the assignment. Everybody's so quiet. Did they have class this morning, Floor? Are they all exhausted from somebody's class? Oh, I can barely hear you, Floor. Sorry, volume.
Oh, I said I don't know.
Okay. Anybody? I can hear you now. Did they have class? You have class this morning, everybody?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
have.
Yeah.
to
have a
do it.
visual effect.
Oh, is it Alex's fault or Christine's fault that you're all like this half dead? What did they do to you? You're all like, oh my gosh. No? No one's gonna admit anything. I don't want anybody getting mad at me. No, it's okay. All right, but it's nice. Again, it's animation class, so it's required you be a bit more animated yourselves, right? So just wake up a little, participate, say a few words, right? It's like, yes, Brett, it makes sense. Anyone? It's all good. Because I
Yeah,
don't hear
makes sense.
okay, if nobody says anything, I'm just going to keep going, and that means it's more complicated. So if you want to say, hey, wait a second, did it make sense or didn't work, you have to speak up. Don't be shy. Okay, because constraints break all the time. Everybody's good?
Yep.
Okay, now the question will arise. Usually it's like, okay, I made a mistake. How do I fix this? What do I do if something breaks and I want to get back to the way things were? On the cube, right, the passenger, you'll see the constraint. It's attached there. So if I wanted to break any connections with the two objects, I could just delete the constraint. And what you'll see is there's still animation going on here. So it looks like they're connected, but if I took the sphere, right, and left that as curves, and I took the cube and made that straight lines, their speeds would be different and they wouldn't match, right? The only reason things are still moving is because I was keying everything. I was hitting S all the time. When you hit S, it will stamp the values onto the constrained object, right? So when there was a constraint, let me just undo a little bit and get back to the constraint. There we go. So when you have an object that is constrained, what you'll notice is that the attributes are a different color. That's the flag that you'll get that something else is responsible for those values. But when you hit S, it will record those positions. So right now you can see with the cube, I have keys, right? So I need those keys to record the positions. And you can see I have translate values, I have rotation values, they're all in here. And if I went in and just deleted them all, right, and just left the first frame, then the problem is that when I turn the constraint off, right, so if I go here and say, well, let's just turn the constraint off, it will go back to the last position that it has a key for or remembered. So that's why I'm so particular about hitting S every time I'm blocking in a new position with the object and the prop and the character, because I need those values to be stamped in, because the constraint is doing the work. This is not at the origin, right? But what's keeping it there is other information, right? Which is coming from this. If I break the connection, then its position will change. And that's always, again, something that's really frustrating as an animator. Like, oh, I want to let go of the prop. And then I turn it to 0. And then whatever they were holding goes flying off screen to a different part of the universe in the scene. You're like, what the hell? Where did the thing go? I want to leave it right there. And then you realize that, oh my gosh, when I set up the constraint, I forgot to key it. I got to go back and redo all the setup because this is going to be a pain. So I've gotten in the habit. It's really important. Key everything, right? Start and end position, key the objects, make sure that those values are getting stamped in. So again, the easiest thing to do is you just grab both and there's a key, S. Go to the next key, S. Next one, S. Next one, S. And you'll see that now I have those values. Now I have actual keys. It is remembering. It's basically I'm stamping this translate position, rotate position on the actual object because it doesn't need it. It's relying on the driver to do that. Okay. But if you hit S, then it will actually have information. It will remember where it is. So if I turn the constraint off, it's not going to go anywhere because it was keyed at this point. Okay. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you try to change this object, it will continue to go back to the constrained position. Even if you look at it and say, oh, yeah, I moved it, right? It's all over here. As soon as you touch this object, it will snap right back. So there's no way you can break or change the position of an object once it is constrained with this kind of setup. So that means you have to be really confident that where you put the prop is in a good spot. So if it's a very simple direct constraint like this, you would take the time to pose the fingers and put the prop in there and make sure, okay, that's the way I'm going to hold this thing. And as long as that's good, and I'm not going to take the object out, it's just going to be in there. I'm holding it with my hand. Awesome. As soon as you want to do something like this, and like now we're looking at more complex setups, which I'm not going to demo because we don't have to worry about that. With Tron, what we have to worry about is how is the character holding the disc? So a more complex shot is where a character is holding an object with 2 hands, and then they block a disc, and then they got to throw. So what's going on is there's a bunch of setups going on there. So what you would probably do is you would have one wrist would be like the main driver of the whole setup. So think of it as like the front of the train is this wrist. Then I would constrain the disc to that wrist. So I move the wrist, it moves the disc. Then I would constrain the IK wrist of this hand to the disc. So it's basically like this little daisy chains of connections. So it's like I'm using this hand, that moves the disc, and that disc moves the wrist. And then when I throw it, I have to, and again, is it that I have a 2-handed block, then I let go of this hand, so it's one-handed, and then I throw it. So what you basically end up managing, it's just like being a lighting manager at like a really complex theater show. Your job is all these switches, and you're keying on the lights on and off when they need to, or a dimmer switch. So you have a much more complex setup. You have to figure out, when do I let go of something? When do I need to have something on and off? And with constraints, what makes it also tricky is when you try to retime animation. So if I am not careful, and let's say I only retime the sphere, but I forget to retime the prop, what can happen is now the constraint switch will be at a different time. So if I take the sphere, its animation, and I move its timing, the problem is that this object hasn't been retimed. So it will click into place sooner than I expected. So it becomes, again, more challenging to edit. So you have to be a little bit more careful about what you're selecting. So if I want to retime things like that, I need to make sure I'm selecting everything. The driver, the passenger, all the connections, all that has to be selected. And now I can go and grab everything and slide that down and not worry. The constraint moves with them. Okay, so there's a lot of things that can definitely trip you up when you're animating characters that need to pick up props and let them go. So I wanted to start with something really simple, right? So the setup is pretty clear. When you pick your shots, again, if you want to pick a simpler shot, the easiest thing is you have a character, they're holding that disc, and you basically you do like go to frame 1 and you set up the relationship between the two. I'm gonna pose out the disc and the hand together. Then I'll create a connection. I'll do a constraint from the wrist going to the prop. And then you do like one frame where you do a transition. It's like 100%, 100%. And then you look for the biggest spacing gap. Look for when it really flicks quickly. Then you have a great moment where like it's 100% and then you pop over 0 and this just goes flying. And the audience will never know that you had a connection because you can hide it. With a big distance, you can hide it. What's much worse is when you have a very subtle connection. So you could imagine even something I'm doing like now, imagine like 2 fingers just touching, right? Just very gently and having to move like that. But when you think about how the fingers are set up, the pivot points are at the knuckles. So you're working from here and from here, and you're trying to get these 2 to connect, right? And they'll go right through each other, right? So that kind of subtle connection is very difficult and sometimes might require a special tool or a different setup, or maybe you need to basically hack into the rig and make different pivot points. So there's always going to be situations. That's usually when people's mind, how do you do this? How do you do this? Don't worry about it. Wait till you get to a problem before you have to have a solution. But even just having 2 characters grab hands like this, and like, okay, that's not too difficult. But what if I wanted, let's say, a character, they're holding an object with 2 hands, they got a rifle, right? And they're running. And then I need to have them hold the rifle with 1 hand, right? And then they throw it to the other one. Or I have a baseball and I'm going to take the baseball, I'm going to throw it my left hand, then throw it to my right hand, I'm going to throw it to another character, right? All of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, so it's like I need a constraint for that hand, a constraint for that hand, and a constraint for another character's hand. That object can have multiple drivers and it's like keying all the switches. But you can also overthink constraints as well. I remember a show that I was on, we got this project, it was from another studio. They had kind of dropped the ball. They hadn't done a good job and the client was upset and they pulled the project. So the studio I was at, they got the project. So we kind of inherited all the mess. So it's really a fun learning experience to open up other people's scenes and realize how bad they're doing things and try to fix what they've done. And there was a shot of somebody juggling, right? So it was a character juggling like 5 or 6 balls and like 2 hands, 6 balls, 12 constraints on and off, right? And the animator that opened this up, it was just like, I don't know what to, I can't fix this. This is a nightmare. And then he just had a really genius moment. And he was like, you know what? To hell with constraints. I'm just going to eyeball it. The ball is in the hand for like 2 or 3 frames. I can fake that. I can cheat that real easy. It's in the air most of the time. So all that he did was he animated a cycle of the arms, right? 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And then he just animated 1 ball, hit the hand, over the other hand there, took that animation and duplicated it 5 times, and then offset each ball the same frequency as the hand. So if it took 4 frames for the hand to go up and down, offset each ball 4 frames. Done. Perfect, right? All by just refusing to accept how complex it was and realize that there was another way to do the problem and not get too bogged down in the constraints. So usually constraints are there to help you get work done. There's no other way to do it. It's tedious, it's time consuming. So like the example I had, a character holding a guitar and they're walking. To try and do that by hand is very demanding. And it also means every frame. Now, as a 2D animator, I'm used to doing that. If I had the character, I would have to draw it all. But it means that the drawings have to be very tightly controlled, very precise, and there's no room for error. But a drawing is more forgiving than a 3D rendered object, right? There's noise. And if you don't get it right, it's going to boil, right? It's going to just vibrate a little bit and it won't feel like it's connected. So it's a way you could work, but it's very hard to edit. It's very difficult for someone else to follow you. So if another artist is a revisionist and they open up your scene, you're like, hey, Brett, I'm going to kill you. You did this all on ones. Why didn't you use a constraint? That's so much easier to edit. We can just move the position. So you need to make sure that you understand constraints are there to help you with animation problems. If a character is holding a prop, there's no other way to do it. You have to learn how to do that. Constraints can help you and you need to learn how to use them to help you, but you can also cheat. Okay. And it depends on the show that you're on. Another way to cheat is that if a character has to throw a ball or pick up a ball, there's always a ball in their hand and you key the visibility. So even though they're not holding anything, there's a ball attached, ready to go, but you've keyed the visibility off and there's a ball on the table. So there's 2 objects in the scene and all you're doing is a visibility trick. So the moment I grab the ball, then I swap the visibility, right? It's very similar to doing a constraint. Over 1 frame, I change 1 ball that was visible, now it's invisible. And the one that was invisible on the wrist is now visible. So you can do that when you're working on your own stuff because you are responsible for the scene. What happens in production when you work that way is that your shot goes downstream and a lighting artist is going to open it up and they're going to look at the storyboard, 1 character, 1 prop. They're going to look at Brett's scene. Hey, Brett was a dum-dum. He put two balls in this scene. I'll delete one because I only need one. Look at the storyboard, right? They'll look at it as like, I'm trying to optimize the scene. Why are there two props? So that's where it can cause issues because you as an animator chose a very quick, dirty, easy way to work. But somebody downstream with no idea how you did it, why you did it, is now stuck in a situation where like, well, I got to optimize my renders. If this is a redundant prop, I'm gonna hit delete. And they're not doing anything wrong. You're not doing anything wrong. You're not talking to each other. And that's where you have these issues. So depending on the project you're working on, you just ask. I've asked people, it's first day, how do you guys work with props? Can I do that visibility trick? Like, no, don't do that. That's causes too much headaches. You can only have the one prop, or you got to make sure you put a note in Shotgun. People have to be able to follow your work. When you're working on your own, there's a lot more flexibility. It's easier to cheat because you know the scene, you're responsible for it, you're shepherding it all the way through production. But when working with other people, some of these strategies are not going to work very well. They'll make you very unpopular because people won't understand what you're doing. Okay. So that's one of the oldest tricks in the book, is just cheating, right? And I've done that even with whole characters. So sometimes it's very difficult to transition a character out of a walk cycle into doing something else. So I just have a character that's walking, and then one frame, I take that walk cycle and I put it through the floor, and then I bring in the other character that doesn't have the cycle, and then I carry on with the scene. And it's over one frame. If nobody sees, nobody knows, nobody cares. I just put a note in there. Hey, there's two characters in my shot. Don't freak out. One is a cycle I put under the floor. It should interact with the lights. Then everybody's happy, right? So always remember that there's so much you can do cheating. It doesn't have to be real. It just has to work. Okay. And that sometimes means that you can overthink a constraint setup a little too much. You want to have the flexibility to animate, but you also want help. I was lucky enough to get a class with an animator, online class, and they'd worked at DreamWorks and they worked on Kung Fu Panda 2. Their character was Lord Shen. I don't know if anybody knows that film. Lord Shen, the peacock, right? The white peacock with and he fought with a large staff, right? With a big blade at the end. So I asked him when I found he worked on it, and he's like, "Did you work on any fight sequences?" "Oh yeah." And I was like, "Oh my God, the constraint setup, that must have been just a nightmare, going from one-handed to two-handed." And he started laughing. I was like, "Oh, poor guy, he's traumatized, right? He still has horrible memories." They said, "Most of the time I cheated." He said, "If you look at the sequence, if you look at all the shots, action sequences, shots are short. They're edited really tight. They're very short amount of frames. So I didn't use constraints most of the time. I would just put the character's hands on the prop and select all three and move them in world space, point A, point B. And I cheated as much as I could. But any of the shots that were the more challenging ones was usually when Lord Shin was talking to people with his staff, when they were acting shots, when he has to hold the staff with the wrist, but has to pivot from the heel, right, down at the ground, and then he has to lift it up and threaten them. So that's where it becomes, that's when you need a tool. There's a lot of frames and you can't cheat. You can't hide that, right? With a fight sequence, things are very quick. You don't have to necessarily get it perfect. It can be close. So it's important to remember that constraints are a very, very important part of your tool set, but it's not always the best option, right? Sometimes it's just faster to cheat, but it really depends on the shot. Okay. Is everybody okay with this info so far? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Wonderful. All right. So now I'm going to put this aside. You no need to save this at all. And we're going to have a look at the files that we have in the week 6 folder. And actually it should be in here, right? The rigs are in here, aren't they? Or do we put it in the rigs folder, correct?
Yep. In the
There we go. And it's in simple,
Simple, yeah.
probably. There we go. So here's the Norman Tron rig. All right. So what you're going to need from here, it is a project. So you can just grab this whole folder, right? Because it's all set up for you. I'll just grab this and I'm going to copy that to my desktop. Hopefully, there we are. And then I'm going to go to Maya, set my project. I'm going to bring in 2 objects. I'm going to reference in the character, reference in the prop. So go here, set my project. And it should be on the desktop. Norman Tron rig. Set my project. And reference in, there's the disk. Please work. Reference, Norman Tron. All right. So let's move these So there's the two objects. And if it's 6, there we go. So there's our Tron Norman ready to go, right? With all the wonderful texture and details that Kendall helped, right? Kendall helped with doing this, right, Floor? I know you were doing some of the Floor rigged the disc. Trying to remember. Now with the disc, the attribute that Floor put in here is there is a little stretch. So if you want to do a little bit of a smear, right, with the disc moving, you can go in and put a little bit of a stretch on this thing. And there's also a secondary ring, right, which gives you a little bit of flexibility. One of the things that you'll notice a lot in studio objects is they're usually rigged. There's a lot of concentric circles. It kind of looks like a tree, right? When you look at it, there's like all these concentric circles to give the animators more and more levels to work with. Because what I can do is I can take this main ring, the outer ring, and I can constrain that to a wrist. And then I can use the inner ring, which is a child, to tweak the pose so that I have something that is free and something that is locked. So this ring's job is just the connection. Its job is to be the glue to connect the two objects together. And this object's job is to give me, the animator, flexibility. So if I want to do something different, if I didn't get the pose right, if the director says, can you change it? I don't like the overhand grip. Can you change it to something else? Let's try going on over the shoulder instead of like this. Let's redo it. But I got a new grip I got to do, right? Instead of overhand or underhand. That's a total setup change. But what you want is to just have an extra ring so you have one level of control. So it's a bit nested. Talk about that in a second. Now with Norman, I think it's already been set up. Nope, it hasn't. So with the Norman rig, remember the feet, you want them to be IK. So if you go here on the list at the bottom, visibility of controls, right? You need to make sure that all the extra controls are turned on. When I referenced in the rig, it was already set up, so it should be good. I'm going to go here, and I'm just going to switch these there. Now I have IK legs. All good. Wonderful. Now to get the prop in the character's arms, this is a choice that I will leave to you. There are advantages and disadvantages to choosing IK or FK. Working with FK, what's nice about FK is that when you work in FK, you get rotation for free, right? So that means the arm moves in arcs. But one of the downsides is what if you have a shot where it's way more important that your focus is, I want to keep the hands close to something. I want to get close to the face. The problem is that you're using a control way over here. And it's like, again, it feels kind of like drawing with a pencil at the end of a construction crane. You're like, geek, geek, geek. Like, damn, it's the wrong place. Geek, geek, geek. And you start again, and it can be very frustrating. But if it's something simple, I'm just doing that, I would totally go FK. It's just swinging the arm. I get a rotation for free. I get a nice arc. Perfect. But when they're doing something like this, where I need the disc to be over their face, then I would probably I would probably go IK because it gives me the control to move the hands around very easily by working with the wrist. But what's hard to do in IK is get an arc. You don't get arcs for free because and again, the elbow a lot of times will flop around. So when you throw stuff, the elbow breaks. So it's a bit more work to clean up. So IK is faster to pose, harder to clean up. FK is harder to pose, but easy to clean up. So there's no right or wrong. It's just what's best for the shot. So if you have a shot where it's just a very simple rotation, I would probably go with FK and use that. Now that's using just one hand. When it's two-handed, then again, you're stuck. You have to pick something to work with. So if you know that at the end of the scene, the character throws like this, I would say, okay, this is FK. I'm going to work from the shoulder, glue the prop, and then the other one's IK, and I'll glue that to the disc, and then I'll get that to work. Okay, so we'll look at sort of what we would do for a simple, quote unquote, simple setup. So let's imagine I'm going to put this in the character's left arm. So I'm just going to pose out the arm. And again, I would normally spend more time getting the grip right, but here I don't really have to. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to grab the disc, bring it into position. And like I said, you don't even have to get it perfect. Let's just imagine we want to hold on to the disc, and I'll just kind of get the wrist kind of close, right? So just imagine it's going to be along the edge of the Frisbee like that. I just want to create a connection between the two. So what do I select first? Does anyone remember what's the order? Who gets selected first in this situation? The prop or the wrist?
The wrist.
The wrist. The wrist is driving everything. So we got to select the wrist. So I'm going to grab the wrist control. Then I'm going to grab the outer ring of the prop. What constraint are we going to use? Which one? It's at the top. Hint.
Parent.
Parent constraint. Okay, we go to the options. Double check. Maintain offset. Yes. Okay. Now, one thing I haven't done, I haven't hit S yet. So I'll set my filters up, make sure I'm going to key everything before I do any constraining. So first step, everything, frame one, key, big red line, all good. Redo the setup. Wrist, prop, constrain. I see my blend parent. Okay, hit S. Now that's keyed. So if I move the arm, right now the prop moves. Okay. If I'm unhappy with the setup, I can still work with the wrists and I know that it's going to move that main control. But if I want to adjust the Frisbee, I would just use this control, right? If I wanted to change its orientation or position, I'll just go back to object mode. Really easy. Let's say I wanted to move it more like that. I could make an adjustment very quickly, right? So now it's in a new orientation. So he's going to hold on the side like that. And it will still work. Okay. So that's why that second ring exists. So you don't have to get the pose perfect. The most important thing is to just get the big ring glued to the wrist. So now the wrist moves, right? And you can see that I can move the arm. If I move the body, right? Everything moves together. Now I have this connection. So I'll just do a very horrible example of sort of a start pose. Let's just twist the character back. Just imagine they're going to lean back and really swing at this thing. And again, with Norman, you do have some setup options I should go through. So when you're going to throw something, right, what's happening is my chest is rotating around my head. My head is oriented straight. It's not moving with it, because then what happens is if I move the chest, then I got to go back and push the head back every frame, which is very annoying. So Norman has a space switch on a couple of controls, and I would recommend you use them, because when you're throwing, there's a lot of, you have a fixed axis of orientation for the head. Also with the arms, if somebody says, you know, twist the chest more, it's, I want to be able to do this. I want to be able to keep the arms in place and move the chest. If I move the chest and the arms move, then it means that I have to counter animate. So if I move the chest more, then I have to change the arms again. But I would rather be able to keep the arms in place and then move and not have to worry about that. So with Norman, you click on the head control. There's this option, parent, world, root, chest. I'm going to get rid of parent being 1 and the world to be 1. And what that means is that when I move the spine or the hip, the head stays in its own orientation. So now I can do this, right? Head stays in one orientation. Perfect for what we're doing. Same thing with the arms. Right now, when I move the chest, the arms are children. They do exactly what the chest does. But I can go grab the top level, right? The shoulder. And again, we have the same options. Zero that out, put it into world. Okay, and what this will allow you to do is when you move the chest or the hips, the arms will keep their orientation, right? So they won't inherit the rotation of the parent. And that makes it a lot cleaner, because what happens is when you look at the way something is moving, it means then I have to take into account every rotation on the spine. Every single one of them is contributing to the arm, and it's harder to clean up. Because when you see a problem on the arm, it may not be the shoulder. It might be the chest or the lower abdomen or the bottom spine. So I like it, and as a general rule, animating this way for this kind of shot. Now, the other setup is exactly what you want for doing flips. Because what I want to do is I just want to flip the hip and then everything follows as a child. So it's not that it's a bad setting. For this shot, it's not the best. So that's why I'm changing the options. If you needed to do a figure skater spinning, I would change all of these back to the way they were at the default. And you could spin Norman's hip like a top and it would do 90% of the work. It would get the character spinning, all the arms spinning, the head spinning exactly like you want. But for this situation, it's much more important to make sure I'm just cleaning up the arm. I just want the arm to rotate. I want the head to stay stable. I want the other arm to be stable. So I have a little bit of, I can shrug the shoulders. I can do all sorts of stuff. Hopefully that's clear, right? Because it wasn't clear to me when I was new. You just see all these options. You say, are they insane? Why don't you just make one setup that's perfect? And the answer is there's no such thing as a perfect setup, right? Everybody's got their own opinion. Everybody has their own approach. That's why the riggers give you options so that you don't be boxed in as an animator, right? And even though Norman, I know people like, oh, what an old rig. It's a fantastic rig. It's so lightweight. It's very easy to use and it's incredibly flexible, which is nice. It has all these different options. I've worked with a lot of rigs in studio that are not as good as Norman is. They look better, they're fancier, but they don't have the simplicity and also the level of functionality, the control. So that's why we're using Norman for this one. Okay, frame one. So let's just move the arm back, swing the body back, right? So there's my pose. I'll grab Norman. I'm gonna look over here. Look over there. I'm going to throw this thing over there as a look at control. So if you want to move that for the eyeballs, I'm going to go over there. So there's a pose. And then I'll just do another extreme pose. And let's just imagine he's going to swing. So we're going to swing the chest, get the arm, swing that all the way through like that. And so like, okay, that's the pose I'm going to get to. Zero everything out. So we get a nice straight arm. So I have this, right? And you can see that I'm getting a little bit of gimbal. I should have checked the gimbal in here. I really want the arm to be up a bit more, sort of as an in-between. So I just want to kind of sculpt a little arc in there. I'm going to throw this thing. So now the real question is, well, where do I turn on and off the constraint? So for that, I need to make sure I'm working with the right prop. I need to make sure that I'm working with this control, right? So I'll just grab everything. S, S, S. So I'll figure out where am I going to let this thing go. So let's say I figure out, okay, I'm going to be here. Let's do a one frame transition. Let's say frame 7 is the last moment I'm holding this thing. And then frame 8, the prop is gone. So I go here. There's my duplicate, basically 2 frames that are side by side. I'll go here to the control that I'm using that has the blend parent attached to it. It's this one here. There's the blend parent. It's 1 here. Then at this point, it would have to be 0. And then if I go here, it would also have to be 0. So what I'm trying to figure out is it's 1 till here, and then it's off. Now, because I've keyed everything, nothing has changed much. It still looks like it's connected. But what I can do is right at this moment, I can grab the control that doesn't have the constraint on it. This hoop that's part of the wrist, it does. Now I can animate the disc to fly away. So it's going to go away. And then it comes back. So I'll just delete that key. So it's here, right? And then from here on out, right? This thing as well, I don't want this to move anymore. If I move this control, right? If I move this, it moves the disc. So I want this to stop moving. So right here, the transition, I want this thing to stop moving. So I'm going to delete that key and that key. So right here, we're here. I'm going to duplicate, do my 1 frame transition. 1, 0. Now I've frozen that control, right? So it's no longer moving. And I can just animate this thing flying off into space. Right? So I have to eventually stop moving this thing because this moves that. If this thing is still being moved by that wrist, it's never gonna, it's always gonna be connected. If the character moves their arm, it's always gonna pipe information there. So I had to lock a position where it drops the disc and swing through. Okay. Now, another nice thing to know, and it's very important for this assignment, is that what you can do is you can basically start working with the character and get a good pose ready and not worry about the prop. Just animate with nothing. Just it's there, but you don't worry about the constraints. Get the blocking done and then go in, because I find sometimes focusing, if it's this simple, I'm not worried about a two-handed setup with an intricate prop. It's so simple, right? It's just, I'm going to throw it. So focus on the posing of the character, get the disc in a good position, make sure the hand there, like make sure it works when you're holding it, and then block everything and leave the disc behind, right? Do your blocking, figure out the scene, then play around with the constraint and say, okay, I need to connect this thing. I have to connect it to the character. And then there's a moment where I have to stop moving it. That's where I do the switch. I figure out that last moment where it's in the hand and then pop, it's over here. But if I'm setting it up the way that I did here, it has to stop moving, because if I move this on the next frame, it's going to move that thing, right? It's going to move it. So because I'm using this control as basically the main control for the disc, this one, I don't want to animate the disc. This one, its job is to be glue. It's just to hold the object. So unfortunately with the setup, if I have it keep moving, if it follows that wrist over there, it's going to add extra movement on the disc. And then it becomes painful because now I got this moving, I got this moving, and they're fighting each other. So I have to make sure I turn off the constraint, and I have to make sure I keep this thing in one place. So you go to that frame and you just duplicate, right? All that I did was just copy this pose, copy and paste. And then what you have to do, oh, fudged it there is the blend parent. What do I need to switch? That's what I need to switch. I have to make sure I have a 1 and a 0 on and off. If I don't have that, it's still going to be stuck to the arm, right? So I just need to find that moment where I'm going to let everything go. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yep.
Now, the video reference that we've provided, what you could do if you want, where's my network? I guess I left it already. You could go and edit the footage and just splice out what you need. You don't have to, but you could. So this video reference, if I copy that and put it into my Tron project folder here, I could put it in source images, paste it in as a reference. I can go grab a free image plane, bring that up, and go to the attribute editor, Control A, and just tell it that it's going to be a movie file, and then go browse for it. And oh, it doesn't like the movie file. There we go. You just have to make sure. Sometimes if it says movie files, it won't see it. You have to tell it all files. I think it prefers MOV as opposed to MP4. Just go grab it, hit open, and we'll see if it'll display. Is it going to work? Maybe not. I think I broke it. There we go. So now what you can do is you can actually look at the video reference, but what if you don't want to start with this shot? What if you want to use this one? Well, what you would look at is, well, I need to do an offset. I want to offset the frame. So if you look at the image plane, what I would like is, if I look at my scene, I could see, well, I would like frame 24 to be frame 1, which means I need to subtract 23. So that when I go to frame 1, it is now synchronized. Okay, just by doing a little offset. All that it did is took all the images in the sequence and just pushed them 23 frames over. So we're starting at frame 24. So now I can start at frame 1, and I want to animate that shot. And then all I need is, okay, that's the last frame. Great, that's all I need, 39 frames. And I have this here to use as reference. And what I always like to do is I'll grab my reference and I'll usually scale it up if I can to be as big as the character, just so I have something that I can kind of compare. But because the reference is so saturated and opaque, it can be a little bit hard to work beside. Sometimes it's a little distracting. So what you can do is go to the alpha and just slide the alpha gain down a little bit. There we go. So you can still see it, but it's not so strong that your eyes are kind of a little bit, it's just hard to stare at all day long, right? But now I've got that. And then you would go and, just like we did for the personality walk, say, well, where are the keys? So I can see this character, they start two-handed, right? Then they let go. So I have a little bit of a complicated setup here. But if I look, how many frames is that hand on there for? 2 frames? I could do 2 frames. I could do 2 frames. I don't have to worry. As long as it doesn't slide around, I wouldn't even bother, right? They take it off. So it's a 2-handed setup, right? And then you'd say, well, where's the anticipation? So look at the hip. Where's the biggest change in the hip right there, low point? There's my antic, or maybe that one. So I'd say, where's the first key? Let's make this one. First frame 1. Find that low point. Then look for a nice throw, right? Maybe a pose there, somewhere in here. So you might do something maybe out to the side. Maybe I'll do a pose there. There's a nice extreme there, right? Because here they're doing something tricky. You see they're trying to throw it around the back, right? So he's doing a little bit of a tricky throw there for Tron to try and dodge. So I'll go grab that one. And then I'll look at, where do I settle? Where's the last pose? So for this, you probably have like 4 or 5 keys that you have to do, right? For like a 30 frame shot, not too many. So it's the start, antic, the breakdown, the throw, and the settle. Do that for next class, 5 poses. Okay. Sound good?
Yeah. For
Mhm.
next week, do you want a step mode or?
Yeah, start in step mode. And given the sort of schedule that we're at, I don't mind if you feel confident to move forward, but save a version. Do a version that's step mode, because we have the work in progress. Play blast your blocking. And if you feel like, yeah, I got this, go ahead and go further. And if I give you any notes, I'm sure you can incorporate that into the spline. Okay? Because I know we have a very short schedule. So start with just the blocking, and hopefully you have the rest of class, 90 minutes, right? Maybe do 3 or 4 poses, right? That's like what, 1 every 10, 15 minutes. That's not bad, right? See what you can get done. And the constraint is not as big an issue. Okay. So do yourself a favor. How's your workload? If you're busy, maybe don't pick the most difficult shot that's in the list here. It's okay to pick something that you're comfortable with, right? We only have a compressed schedule. Just do really good with the shot that you have, right? And it's very short, it's just a little bit over a second. I'm trying to be merciful to everybody to compensate for the fact that you have less time. So hopefully this is a little bit of relief to people. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So, make each pose count, right? Because your keys are so critical to driving the rest of the animation. So just like we did for the personality walk, right? Have a look, do a draw over, right? That's a really important thing to do. Just do a thumbnail sketch. You can try using the grease pencil tool as well, just to draw over your scenes. It's not mandatory, but when I look at this, right, what do I see as the biggest line, right? Always think of this like a letter A. When you're looking at human beings, look at the letter A. It helps so much with your drawing, right? Where's the lean? Where's the foot? Where's the head? And then I keep going forward and say, where's this pose, right? Look at that wind up. That's a really nice pose. So it's very similar, but look at how that's changed, right? Look at the compression that's in here, that arm straightening out, right? Just to help you, get inspired by a shape, so that when you go to the rig, you're going to force it to do more than you would. I find that if you just go to the rig, what we tend to do is like, you kind of like, well, I guess that's as good as it gets, and you just accept it. But if you do a drawing, and even if it's a simple crude gesture, you're like, I want that. I'm going to fight for it. I love that line. It just changes your mindset, because when I was new, again, you're so timid and you just don't want to break anything. You're like, I guess that's all it can do. But I was always so frustrated. I would just find I would draw, and then it would help me just try harder and say, I got to get this rig to do this. I can't unsee that pose. I can't accept that's the best this rig can give me. Okay. Think of things like lines. Look at where you see contrasting curves. Look where you see tension. So right here, right, this is a great pose as well, because it shows a lot of tension in the spine right there. Maybe that one. Let me just start drawing here. You can see their back, right? So you can see the back is twisting. The hip is side view, but the chest, you can see the back, right? You can see the back of it. There's a scapula there. There's another one. Get that line in there, right? Try to get that lean, get that balance. All the stuff is there. Don't rotoscope, right? Don't just look at it and not think, but take a second, look at the pose, do a quick little thumbnail, and then jump in and start moving the controls. Okay. You've only got to do about 4 or 5 poses. So it's definitely much more manageable. It's almost close to like what we did for the walk cycle. Okay. Now the setup for the prop, again, I would recommend you try but don't make it the focus right now. Get the first couple poses in, try to get the prop in there. If you can at least get the prop connected to the wrist and it looks okay, great. But usually I find that the first time you try doing this, you're going to get it wrong. So you're going to delete the constraint anyway. So just get it close, see if it's there. And if you can connect it to, great. Remember, you can use this little control to nudge and tweak and fudge things. If the main control, you just kind of, it's close. You don't have to worry about being perfect. Don't even worry about letting go of the prop. If you're like, I got it connected, I'll worry about letting it go later. Okay, just swing through and try and get the setup to look good. All right, that takes us pretty much to break time. Oh, Flora, I'm sorry. I forgot to pause the recordings to do chapters. I'm
It's okay,
sorry.
'cause it's okay. I
Okay.
kind of noted where the
Okay, thank
what
you,
the
Flora.
division was. Yeah, no
Sorry about
worries.
that.
We can pause this one though for the break.
Yeah, so we'll stop here.